So welcome back, and thank you for coming. This is the second half, the second day of our meeting. As you can tell, we've structured the meeting so that in the first part of yesterday morning, we were focusing on the fauna, and then we segued to the terrestrial records of African climate change, and now we'll have several talks on the marine record of African climate change. Provides a different perspective, and it promises to be a really interesting time. So we are going to have the same thing as yesterday. We have a coffee break, and then we'll also have lunch for everyone. So for those of you who are here, you're welcome to join us for lunch. And then after lunch, we're going to have a keynote speaker, Paul Falkowski, who's going to give us a really mind-bending lecture on how to really think about climate life. No, I'm setting you up, Paul, right? Yeah. Yeah, nobody told me that, right? And then we're going to have a film for those of you who'd like to see the film. Some people wanted to see the Lamont Core repository, and if we can find a time to do that, maybe during lunch, we can just do sort of an informal walkthrough. We don't have a whole lot of time to do it, but as long as not everyone in this room wants to go walk through the Lamont Core repository, I'm happy to walk you guys through it. We just hired a new director of the Lamont Core repository. As some of you know, it's the world's largest collection of deep sea sediment cores. We've roughly got about, I think, something like 40,000 cores from all over the world's oceans. And Maureen Ramo is our new director of the core repository. And she's really just transformed this space. It's a work in progress, but we can show you that. And we also have a new stable isotope lab that I can walk you guys through as well. So with that, by way of introduction, one thing for the speakers, there's a signature sheet circulating around. I'm just wanting to get signatures from everyone, not to use it for any nefarious purpose, but what I wanted to do is the donor who's supported this meeting wasn't able to be here, but I wanted to just let her know we're here. And I think she'd really appreciate just getting that note from you. And I also want to develop, if we can get a group photograph, I want to have a group photo and then have that sheet and give that all to you as a little memento of having been here. Okay, so our first speaker was selected as the first speaker because he always gives a great talk. René Bovet is one of the world specialists in Bovid evolution in Africa, and so René.
Good morning. No pressure here, Peter, but very pleased to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Can everybody hear me in the back? If I step away, you can still hear me? The microphone is on? Okay, good. So wanted to talk about some of the ways in which we can study the fauna and faunal responses over time to some of these climate patterns that we've been discussing here. And I'll be talking about, you've seen quite a bit of Africa, and we'll see a little bit more of that, but a couple of the places where I work. One is the Afar Triangle right here, and several of the talks yesterday dealt with this part of the world, and the other one is the Omo-Turkana Basin here, and I think Naomi did a very nice job yesterday highlighting some of the key aspects going on in these areas with regard to stable isotopes. So these are, again, we'll be revisiting these areas, but from somewhat different perspectives. When we zoom in here into Eastern Africa along the Rift Valley, the localities that we have, here's the Omo River coming from the Ethiopian highlands into Lake Turkana. So the Omo River is in Ethiopia. The lake itself is basically in Kenya. And here we have several formations, Kanapoi, Nawata, Nachukui, Kubifora. And in the Omo region, we have Shingura, Usno, and Mursi. And we get quite a bit of paleontological data from these areas. And in the Afar area, we have the Hadar and Busidima formations. Coming down closer to the ground, this is what some of these places look like. This is overall the Hadar formation. Here's the Awash River. Hadar, famous for the location where Lucy was found many years ago. And we use in these areas many of these volcanic ash layers, very well dated by colleagues, including essentially people working at Utah, among other places. But these ash layers are used for correlating within these sites, but also correlating through time patterns that we can get in much further out. So this ash layer here is also found, for example, in places like the Turkana Basin, some 800 kilometers south of the slide in the previously. So we get these very widely distributed ash layers, which would represent very massive volcanic eruptions. And I will show you, I think, what might be one example of the possible effects of these ash layers. But they're also used for dating and correlation of the sites. I want to show you very quickly a few of the specimens that we get in this context. Lots of crocodiles in the fossil record. These are very common, very abundant. They form a major part of the fauna, and one of the reasons is that in many of these places we get sediments that are fluvial or deltaic or lacustrine in some cases, but mostly aquatic or close to water. Therefore, aquatic animals are quite common in this area. So another one that's very often found is remnants of hippos. That's a whole, almost complete hippo mandible with a very nice preservation. The whole dentition is there. The preservation of the bone is actually very, very, very good, with really good surface preserved in these cases. In these areas, we also get very commonly these horn cores of antelopes, and these are very useful. We study the shape of the horns to tell us about different species that we get of antelopes, and very frequently you can get just a little fragment of a horn core like this, and you can tell one species from another, so very useful. Other types of fossils that are fairly common here include suids. There's a whole skull of one of these extinct forms, but these are some of them relatives of the modern warthog, and some lineages that have gone extinct. But suids, again, pig relatives, are quite common in these contexts. And we also get monkeys. Here's one example of Therapithecus. This is an extinct relative of the modern gelada baboons, and these can be at times quite common in the record as well. And I wanted to show you a couple of other groups. Lars did a beautiful job yesterday talking about carnivore evolution. I wanted to show you some of the specimens that we get from these areas. This is a relative of the raccoon dog, this one from Dikika in Ethiopia, very nicely dated to 3.3 or so million years ago. So this sort of specimen indicates the presence of these fairly rare canids being part of the record as well. And just one more that I want to show you here. Again, Lars also made a very good point yesterday talking about the body size changes in the carnivore fauna, and this is one of the specimens that we got from Dikika a few years ago. It's a giant otter. We estimate only very roughly based on the size of the face that we have here, and we have some limb bones, an animal of about 200 kilograms. So this would have been probably not something you want to encounter when you go swimming in the river. So very, very large otter that's now extinct. Of course, part of the landscape here is the hominins. And you can see there's the whole dentition, there's the eye socket, the orbit, part of the zygomatics. So hominids are certainly part of this landscape. This is a specimen that was just coming into exposure a couple of years ago, also from Ethiopia. And I'll be saying a few more things about these hominids as part of the overall mammalian fauna. Now, with all of these specimens that we get from the areas that I've shown you here, Ethiopia, northern Kenya, and added to the work that many colleagues have been doing in these geological formations for decades now, we've been able to build a series of databases that contain a lot of information about each of these fossil specimens. And today we work with what we call the Turkana Basin database. Right now, it's got about 17,000 or so fossil specimens. This is something that Kay Berensmeyer and I have done in collaboration with the National Museums of Kenya. We also work a lot with the OMO database that my colleague Jerry Eck was very instrumental in putting together. And there's a French version and an American version. So it comes in two flavors. And from the Hadar area, we have the Dikika database that Zerai Halim-Seged is instrumental in impulsing. And we have a Hadar database that my colleague Kay Reed has been working on very extensively. So with these databases, we're able to do a lot of the analysis that I'll be showing you now. And again, this is based on some of the fieldwork that we have ongoing, as well as work that's been done by many other colleagues over a long period of time. And based on this, I wanted to show you a few examples of some of the patterns that we get from the fauna. Some of these we consider geologically short-term changes. And one example I want to show you here is that when we look at the record from the Omo, so this would be in southern Ethiopia, and we look at the proportion of these antelopes that we call the Alcelafini and Antelopini, and you heard about these yesterday. These kinds of antelopes are quite rare in the record from the Omo, and you see here, this goes from about 3 million years to about 2 million years, roughly. And if you look at this pattern right here, we get a fairly low abundance of these antelopes, with the exception, of course, of this huge peak that's right along what we call member F, and that's about 2.4 million years. And within this member, we actually have one locality that's L398 that has a very high proportion of these antelopes in relation to what we might call the background level here. So quite a striking peak there. And what is happening? Well, when we look at this area in more detail, it turns out that right at the base of this member, we have a volcanic ash layer, one of these massive eruptions that I showed you slides of. And this locality that has got the high peak is sitting right on top of that volcanic ash layer. And we see that the scale here overall for the whole member is about 20,000 years. So for these members, we have each one sampling a few thousand years. And note that after this peak, we kind of go back to the background levels that we had before. And we think that what's happened here is that that peak is represented by relatives of the wildebeests, and these are animals that are primarily grazers. So our interpretation of that pattern is that one of these volcanic eruptions presented a major disruption in the landscape, and then we have this likely influx of antelopes of this kind. And after some few thousands of years, then likely the vegetation returned to where it had been, and the overall abundance of these wildebeest relatives goes back down to where it was before. So in geological scales, this is a relatively short event, short duration. Of course, we're talking about a few thousand years in terms of the resolution that we have, but this would be an example of the kinds of responses that we can see in the antelope, the bovid fauna, to a likely environmental disruption caused by volcanism. I want to show you here too, based on well, some of the comments that Naomi made yesterday about the fact that here we're looking at specimens. So we're in the Omo Turkana area in the Rift Valley, and by nature we're dealing with environments that are complex. We have quite a bit of topography and vegetational complexity, and this is also very well reflected in the fauna. And the example I want to show you here, we're looking at two sites that are contemporaneous, both of them just slightly younger than 2 million years. Naomi actually mentioned this one yesterday too. This is up in Kubifora, Area 41. And just want to show you here, don't worry about the actual labels, but these are different groups of antelopes, different groups of bovids. And we get 3 groups that are dominant, another one that is a little bit less so. But when we compare just this distribution right here to a site of the same age, but closer to the axis of this sedimentary basin, closer to the Omo, we get a very, very different distribution of these antelopes. And here you get essentially one taxon that is very dominant, and the other one's much more rare. And the one peak here corresponds to relatives of the modern waterbuck. So these are animals that are likely associated with floodplains and grazing in floodplains. But regardless of how we might interpret the meaning of this pattern, it's very clear that within a single level, we can have quite a bit of heterogeneity. And here we're dealing with a distance of a few tens of kilometers, with one sample coming from close to the axis of this major river basin, and the other one from a more marginal area. And this is well reflected, I think, in the fauna that we're looking at. Let me show now a few examples of what we might call more long-term responses. And over the time interval here of the Pleistocene, when we look at these major groups of mammals that I've pointed out, we get significant changes in the abundance of these different families over time. Antelopes. Of course, today antelopes are the most common family of mammals in most of the East African landscapes where we work. If you go to most of the to the national parks in the eastern part of the continent, the antelopes are the most common group, quite typically. And here we're looking at the proportion of the antelopes in relation to the whole mammalian fauna from about 4 million years to about 1 million years in the Omo. And main thing to notice that this pattern is not even at all, that instead we have a whole time interval in the earlier part of the sequence here when these bovids are relatively more rare than later on when they become significantly more abundant. So big changes in the overall abundance of these antelopes. Some of the other very common mammals here include, I mentioned to you, the suids before. And with the suids, we have a very interesting situation in that in some of the earlier part of the sequence here, they're quite common. This is a sample from a place where we're working these days called the Mursi Formation in the lower Omo Valley. And here the suids are the most abundant of all the mammals. And a little bit less so in samples that come from later in time, and then they become, they're an important part of the fauna, but they do become more rare. So significant changes then in the distribution of these animals over time. And if we look at some of the other taxa that are very common, monkeys. In this case, note that in that early sample that we have, that's where we get all of these pigs, we actually have no monkeys there, 0 at the moment. They'll probably show up soon, but the sample is not very large. We only have a few hundred specimens, but essentially no monkeys. But in this Omo sequence, there are parts of the sequence in which the monkeys become very, very abundant, and then they decline later on. And want to show you what happens with what the pattern is for hominins. And if we put hominins in the picture here, so here's the pattern that I showed you for the monkeys. The abundance of hominins in this sequence is kind of consistently low overall. In this example, we have 89 specimens of hominins in a total sample of a little bit over 10,000. So overall abundance would be a bit less than 1%. And also, so this goes from the Mursi Formation, where we have no primates at all, so no monkeys, no hominins, up to about 1 million years. And I want to show you some new data that we have from the endpoint here, and this is work that, that my colleague John Wynn has put together, and we're just about ready to submit this. This is new data from the Mursi Formation. So we have this one part of the landscape where we get a lot of suids, no monkeys, no hominins so far. But I want to show you just the stable isotopes for delta C13 that we have. And here we have dinotheres. This is an extinct group of proboscideans, so they're relatives of the elephants. And this is the one group that shows a very heavy C3 signature, so these would be almost completely browsers. And then we get some of the other elephants that show a signature that's a little bit more towards the C4 end of the spectrum here, but certainly not grazing to a large extent. And some of the other browsers that we get are the Tragelaphus, the kudus, impala right there. And these suids that we have that are very common, they have a diet that looks somewhat mixed, but somewhat more C3 than what we get in later samples from this region. So again, this is something that we're about to submit. I'd be very interested to see if we get comments about this from the many stable isotope experts that we have here. Now, I want to show you some other examples of what happens with the mammals here, and looking at antelopes and the proportions of the different tribes over time. This is in the Hadar sequence in the Afar triangle. And we're looking here at the proportion of these bovids that are the wildebeest relatives and the gazelle relatives here. So here's proportion. And over time, what we have is, this is the Hadar formation per se. And this shows their abundance. And the main thing I want to show you here is that between the main Hadar area, the abundance of these antelopes goes up in relation to what we have in the interval that's right around 2 to 2.5 million years. And if we look a little bit more broadly here and go back to the Omo sequence, here we're looking at the same proportion of antelopes over time, again 4 million to 1 million years. And this is from the Omo Turkana area. And just a couple of points here. One is that when we look at different areas within the basin, just like when I showed you at any one time interval, we can have very different proportions of the antelopes. When we look at the pattern over a few million years, we get that in the earlier part of the sequence, the proportion of these antelopes, as I showed you before, in the almost very, very low. The Alcelaphines, so the wildebeest relatives, and the gazelles are quite rare in the Omo during this time, but they become more common as we go into sediments that post-date 2 million years or so. In the eastern part of Lake Turkana, the Kubifora Formation, the pattern looks different, but overall there's also an abundance increase after 2 million years. And the pattern is still different when we look at the west side of Lake Turkana, with overall higher abundances of these antelopes. But what we see here is sort of a convergence when we get into this time after 2 million years. And let me turn this graph, I'll just rotate the axis here. So the data that we're looking at here is the same that we had in the previous slide, just turned with time going from 7 million years. I've added the fauna from some of the late Miocene sites that we have, so 7 million to 1 million years. And again, here we have Omo, Kubifora, Nachukui, that's called the Canopoi area, and Lothagam. So again, this is the same that I just showed you, but I'm adding here a measure of the diversity of the bovid fauna overall in relation to sample size, and we use an index called Fisher's alpha. And basically, just want to point out that when we get this convergence here of in the three areas towards higher proportion of these kinds of antelopes, this is also a time when the overall diversity of the antelopes is highest. And wanted to show you this in relation to Naomi's talk yesterday, and Turi Serling also pointed this out. So this is data from Naomi and Turi and colleagues. And here we have again the Kubifora, Nachukui, and Shungura areas. And the point that was made yesterday is that, that even though we get different patterns in these three areas, overall they converge in the later part of the sequence towards more C4 vegetation. And if we look at if we superimpose here the pattern that we get with the bovids that I showed you in the previous slide, we get a very similar pattern. Now, of course, the axes are different, but this is the abundance of the antelopes that are indicative of grasses, and we get a very similar pattern with the antelopes as we do with the stable isotope data. So that's for Kubifora. This is what we get for Nachukui and for Omo. And again, so looking at this area, during this time interval, we get these two very independent lines of evidence sort of converging on the sense that, overall we have three areas of a basin that are distinct in terms of their environments over long time intervals. But these three areas, all of them become more open, more grassy, more C4 when we get to that interval that post dates 2 million years ago. One more, I think just one more aspect of the fauna that I want to show you. I had a slide here that didn't work, so I had to erase it, but essentially just want to give you a view of what we see in several lineages of these mammals, and here I'll just show you what we get with the suids. And as we get these increases in the proportion of antelopes that are adapted to grasses, we also get significant changes in the actual morphology of some of these animals, and this is an example from the suids, the pigs. And I showed you before that at this time interval, this is the time when in the Mursi area we have a very high abundance of suids. And it's interesting that even though they're very common in terms of numbers of individuals in some of these areas, the diversity is not so great. And the diversity actually increases as we go into later parts of the sequence. But at the same time, in all of these lineages of suids, we get this convergent increase in hypsodonty, which means, as we saw yesterday as well, just the height of the teeth in relation to the width. So tremendous increase in hypsodonty over time. And with specimens, again, once we get into this time interval, 2 to 1 million years ago, becoming hyper hypsodont. And meanwhile, what's happening with the hominids? We're trying to relate some of these evolutionary patterns to human evolution. It's the topic of this symposium. And hominids are, showed you before, certainly part of the landscape here. I showed you with the Omo sequence that they're not terribly abundant, less than 1% of the fauna overall. This is another example that this is data that actually Naomi and Kay Berensmeyer and I and Chris Campesano collected some years ago at Kubifora, where we tried to consistently record everything over a given surface, and the abundance of the different mammalian groups that we get in this one sample has a lot of bovids, a lot of hippos, suids, monkeys, elephants, some undetermined carnivores. And here are the hominids. In this sample, we actually found one hominid tooth. Very exciting. So just in this one sample, the overall abundance of the hominids is roughly 0.5%. One more example. This is one that my colleague Jerry and I collected in the Busidima Formation in the Harar area. And likewise here we get a lot of antelopes, monkeys, suids, etc. And here we got also one hominid. So in this example, again, 1 out of 196, so roughly 0.5% of the fauna. Now, why am I talking about this? Okay, so relating patterns of faunal evolution to what we get with hominids. Here, I want to show you just 2 examples very quickly. We've talked about Paranthropus, hyper quickly. Paranthropus boisei, and the last occurrence of this taxon is 1.4 million years, and we can actually estimate what the likelihood is of this extinction event, or the last record being an actual extinction event based on the abundance of this particular species and the nature of the record that comes later. And we can put error bars here, and for the last appearance datum of Paranthropus boisei, we get a 95% confidence interval that is almost the same chronological length as the life of the species. Basically, this means that we have a very poor idea of when this hominin goes extinct. So that's one example of extinction. One example of origination, Homo ergaster, earliest record at about 1.9 million years. And we can also put a 95% confidence interval here. And we need to go quite a bit back before we can have any confidence that this particular species is actually absent from the landscape, going back to almost 2.4 million years ago. So let me finish. So we have that, I tried to show you that we can get a whole range of responses in the mammalian fauna during the late Cenozoic. But much of this has to do with local and regional conditions, but also we get patterns that overall seem to reflect broader changes. And some of these can be short-term, but with quite a bit of geographic variation going on here. And some of the key changes have to do with changes in the proportions of mammals or adaptations such as grazing, and with the time interval after 2 million years being quite critical. And a key point here, too, is that when we try to put hominids into this picture, because their abundance is so much lower than what we get in some of these other animals, then the patterns for human evolution become much more problematic. Thank you very much.
So good morning, everyone. And this is the start of a number of talks, several of which will be on marine sediments. We're also going to be having some talks by students. We've invited 2 students to join us for this morning session as well. So I thought I'd take up where Renee left off in his really excellent talk on the Bovid evolution side of things. And the question that I wanted to consider in this discussion was what caused this expansion of grasslands, this change in Bovid diversity that Renee was just talking about at roughly 2 million years ago in the early Pleistocene. And this work is really led by some amazing work by Sarah Feekins, who's here today and going to be speaking this morning, Tim Eglinton, who's now at ETH, and then I'll be talking about some climate modeling results that actually comes from Chris Brierley and Alexei Fedorov, who are up at Yale. I gave this talk at AGU or something like this at AGU, and right after that meeting, we had a chance to talk with them, and this is they really added a very important part to the puzzle on this. And then my postdoc and former student, Caroline Cleroux and Jennifer Arbucheski. So I was just going to do provide an overview of really two things that are really emblematic of African climate over the last 5 million years. So over the time scale of human evolution, over the time scale of all the Bovid changes that we've been seeing, or the mammalian changes that we've seen over the last day and a half, this is really the climate backdrop to what was happening in terms of the life on the Savannah or life on the African region. The first involves what we call orbital wet-dry cycles, and these are periods of wetter and drier climate paced by orbital precession that Rick Potts spoke about yesterday. And then the second issue is what we would call a secular change or a long-term transition to more open vegetation conditions after about 2 million years ago. So I'll very briefly go over this just to bring us all up to speed. This is also a way to introduce my student Cassie Meyer's talk that will be coming up later on this morning. And then we'll get into this question in a little bit more detail. So the monsoon forcing, this is actually a figure taken from my former advisor Bill Ruddiman's textbook on climate, but the story of African climate would be very incomplete if we didn't mention orbital precession, which is really the pacemaker of climate change throughout North Africa in particular, but in particular with East Africa as well, such that variations in the Earth's orbit about the sun change the seasonal distribution of radiation at a given latitude for a given season. In the case of North Africa in the subtropics, and in the tropics too, the enhanced solar radiation during boreal summer at roughly 10,000 years ago, in this time in here, would have led to an increase in summer season radiation. And this is what drives the monsoonal circulation, bringing wetter conditions during the summer months, where we get the inflow of moist maritime air from the oceans, and enhanced rainfall during times of enhanced precessional forcing. So that if we look at this astronomical orbital curve for precession over the last 150,000 years, we can see that there were these periods when we would have expected from theory that there would be these wet phases in North African climate. And indeed, when we go to the archaeological record, in fact, George, this is one of the places that we wanted to visit here in Libya, and this is Algeria. This is a lake that's roughly the size of the United Kingdom. One of these mega lakes that are in North Africa. This is just one of many. Mega Lake Chad was in here, which is twice the size of New York State 10,000 years ago. And adjacent to some of these lakes are these just incredible cave drawings of fauna that are, of course, no longer in these highly desertic regions today. But here you can see an image of an elephant and some of the bovids that Renee was talking about. So this would have been for the Holocene, and all these places in green are places where we know that there were paleo lake levels, high lake levels during this period of the early Holocene. So there wasn't just one of these human events, but actually there were many. There was, in fact, hundreds. And we know that based on this Sapropel record that Rick Potts talked about in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Eastern Mediterranean is a very salty ocean. It's about 40 parts per thousand. The typical ocean is about 35 parts per thousand. As a result of it being so salty, during the winter months when the water cools, that water sinks and then that ventilates, that brings oxygen to the bottom oceans. And that results in a very strong oxidative environment for the deep sea sediments. And during these times of very strong Mediterranean ocean convection, we get the deposition of calcium carbonates in the sediments. But there have been times in the past when Africa was wetter, when enhanced outflow from the Nile established a freshwater cap on top of the Mediterranean and established these periods when that deep convection shut down, and we have accumulation of very organic rich sediments, which are known as sapropels. And this is a sediment core that's roughly 10 meters long, and you can see these sapropels just very, very clearly delineated in these sediments. And these are 20,000 year cycles. They're just like barcodes that you can see. In fact, if you go to a bar in Sicily, this is from Fritz Hilgen. This is roughly 1 million years worth of these sapropels. And I think you can see these individual sapropels here bundled in groups of 4 or 5. Again, this is eccentricity modulation of precession. And this is just telling us that African climate has had these tides of the desert, the sweeping of wetter and drier conditions for millions of years. And it's been sort of the steady state background story to North Africa. And I would argue that superimposed on that oscillation of wetter and drier climates, there's been a trend toward more open, arid landscapes. And much of the insight on this is actually coming from the people in this room, Turi and Renee in particular. This is actually a summary, again, of the slide that Turi showed. And he shows that the percentage of grazers, the percentage of grass eaters in the mammalian record from Omo increases markedly after about 2 million years. And also, there's also a first appearance of many grazer species also around this time as well. And as Renee showed, also the diversity of bovids increased after this time as well. The other evidence for this actually comes from Sarah Feakin's work that was published in Geology in 2005, where we revisited an ocean drilling program site that was collected, actually a deep sea drilling program site that was drilled back in 1972. And Sarah sampled this core and measured organic compounds that can be used to trace the savanna grasses. And so this just shows you the modern extent of savanna grasses in this location. And what Sarah did was to focus on the plant wax molecules, and we'll be having a number of lectures on this today because this is an extremely powerful new proxy for our community that has just tremendous application to this problem of climate and life over these kinds of timescales. And the idea behind Sarah's work here was to extract from these ocean sediments compound classes of organic molecules that derive originally from plant waxes, that derive from plant tissues. These are plant wax, these are alkanes, or in this case it's a 26 carbon chain alkanoic acid. These can be extracted. We're using a GC, and this is time versus retention time versus intensity. And whenever you see this interdigitation of odd over even preferences, that just shouts at you saying, I come from a plant. And what can be done, actually in a lab that we've just now built at Lamont, we can have a GC coupled to a mass spectrometer to actually measure the carbon and actually hydrogen isotopic composition of these compounds. And this is something that Turi showed earlier yesterday, that if we focus on C3 plants, and actually Rowan gave us a very good introduction on this as well, you can easily distinguish between C3 and C4 plants using the carbon isotopic composition. So this was the application of Sarah's study that was published in 2005. And I'm sure some of you have seen this, but you can see this really marked transition from more depleted to more enriched values in carbon isotopes, spanning a really broad interval of time going from 9 million years to about 3.7, 3.4, 2.4, 1.7, or about 1.4. And what Sarah had shown in this paper is that the orbital scale variation of the landscape is huge, which shows that this orbital, this precessional control of the monsoon is really shaping in a very large way how the landscape is changing on very short time scales, much shorter than faunal lineages. But there is this long-term secular change as well toward more open vegetation, more C4 vegetation. And this was shown, I think, perhaps extremely compellingly by Turi's work that he presented yesterday. And this is just to give kudos to Turi, and that shows very clearly that after about 2 million years ago, the environment shifted from a woody bushland to something that would be, I guess, a woody savanna, a savanna with some wood cover. But after about 2 million years ago, environments with roughly 50% of woody cover effectively disappeared from the basin. So there's something happening at about 2 million years, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So this is just a summary of the evidence that East Africa became, I put a question mark here saying drier. We just see an expansion of C4 vegetation. And as Rowan gave in his talk yesterday, the presence of C4 grasses can have many different interpretations, including water stress, heat, and seasonality. So something allowed for the expansion of C4 vegetation roughly after 2 million years ago. And it's a puzzling time for us. If you come from a paleoceanographic background, which is what I do, most of us, I think, intuitively would have said, oh no, this should have happened around 3 million years ago, because 3 million years ago is when we have the onset of northern hemisphere glaciation. 2 million years is not that interesting to a paleoceanographer, and it wasn't really very interesting until a few years ago. So the timing of this was really kind of puzzling, because we would have expected the emergence of more open vegetation to have coincided with the onset of northern hemisphere glaciation roughly around 3 million years ago. Instead, it's happening around 2. So why did this happen? So in the literature, there are a number of different ideas. I had proposed a long time ago that it was due to the onset of northern hemisphere glaciation, that you can show using climate models that if you put a big ice sheet in the northern hemisphere, that North Africa becomes drier. East Africa doesn't care. I think I'm wrong. I think this idea that I proposed then, it works for North Africa, but it doesn't explain East Africa, and the timing's wrong. North Africa should have been dry at 3 million, and it's not. The evidence now weighs in pretty strongly at 2 million. Turry had proposed that lower carbon dioxide might have been the result of the C4 expansion, but this largely explains the sort of longer term, what Rowan had shown in his talk, the longer term emergence of savanna grasses. But this event at 2 million years, we know of no carbon dioxide excursions that date to about 2 million years. That said, we don't know anything about carbon dioxide going back 2 million years. So for East African uplift, this is another idea that's actually as old as this topic is. This is sometimes called the East Side Story, where the tectonic construction of topography in East Africa, most notably Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro, are actually relatively young edifices. This idea got a little bit of play in the late 2000s, and I think it's wrong in the sense that you would have had to uplift the whole terrain from Tanzania up to Ethiopia at exactly the same time in a very sudden way for this mechanism to work. That said, it's a very effective way to dry out a region is to just pop it up in the atmosphere. So I would argue that none of the three of these are satisfactory. And so another idea has emerged largely from the really groundbreaking work of Christina Rovello. But there's been a group of us that have been sort of fleshing out the story about what happened in the tropics, particularly what happened in the tropical oceans. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So to sort of understand the background behind this, if one looks at the tropical oceans today, this is sea surface temperature. The purple bits are warm, roughly 29 degrees centigrade water. The green and yellow bits are cooler water, roughly 10 degrees cooler than that, 8 degrees cooler than that. And if you just look at the equator, you see something that's not necessarily what you would expect intuitively, which is that there are very strong east-west temperature gradients that exist right on the equator. The eastern Pacific, for example, is 8 degrees cooler or so than the western Pacific. The eastern Atlantic is cooler by about 3 degrees than the western Atlantic. In the Indian Ocean, it's cool along the margins of Somalia and Oman and the Arabian Peninsula because of cold water upwelling here, and then it's really warm in the eastern Indian Ocean. So why is that? If we do a vertical section in the ocean on the equator, so this is going down to 200 meters, following that same line, you can see that have a very strong, steeply dipping thermal gradients that indicate that along the equator, in the eastern parts of these tropical basins, we get the upwelling of cold subsurface waters to the surface. And it's this physical linking between the trade wind field and the physical upwelling of cool subsurface waters in the tropics that give rise to this east-west or zonal sea surface temperature asymmetry. And what's cool is that if you look at the atmospheric response to this to these ocean temperature gradients, this is the evaporation minus precipitation plot. Wherever you see green is where it's raining on a mean annual basis. And if we just draw a contour around that, and then take that contour and put it on top of the ocean temperature field, it tells you what the answer is. Basically, where it rains in the tropics is where the warm water is. The rainfall, the atmospheric convection follows where the heating is in the ocean. If the ocean temperatures are warmer in the Pacific, that's what makes that the rainiest place on the planet. If you have cold water on the equator off of the Galapagos, it makes that, as we all know, a very dry place. So where you get warm and cool water in the tropics will dictate whether it rains or whether it's dry in those regions. So this is a hypothesis that I wanted to explore, is that maybe this transition that we see in East Africa has nothing to do with those other ideas that we talked about, but actually has something to do about the tropical oceans. So I'll just jump straight away into some of the data that we've collected. So what we've assembled here are a bunch of ocean drilling program sites. So this is this International Ocean Drilling Program, where we've drilled a number of sites in the oceans. And these core sites are in locations that are sampling the west and the east temperatures at a given location. And this is for the Atlantic. We have 3 sites in the Atlantic, and this is actually Janet Feng's master's thesis work, some of it. And this is work done by Christina Ravello. And these are some sites that we've done ourselves, and also a group from Brown. And so to make these temperature reconstructions, we use a mix of methods. Sometimes they're alkanone sea surface temperature records, as is from this site, and some of these sites, and sometimes they're using magnesium-calcium ratios in planktonic foraminifera. So the first thing I want to point out is that today there would be cooler waters at this site here off of Oman because of upwelling of cool water. And then this site here would be relatively warmer, again because of this, this pool of warm water in the tropical Pacific and eastern Indian Ocean. And if you just jump up to the top here at 0, you'll see that the blue site, which is site 722, and I'm sorry, that's a typo, that site 722 is indeed cooler by a couple of degrees than this site over here to the east. But then as you go back in time, you see that they start to go right on top of each other, that there was no east-west temperature gradient prior to about an interesting time, around 2 million years ago. If we look at the Pacific Ocean, this is work done by Christina Ravello and her then student Mike Wara. In blue is the site from this site here in the eastern Pacific where we know it's cooler. And in red is the site from the Antong-Java Plateau, which is over here in the western Pacific. Again, if we look at the top, these are separated by roughly 6 or 8 degrees centigrade, which is what we expect. That's about the modern east-west temperature gradient today. And then as you go back in time, at some point they get on top of each other, indicating a collapse of this east-west temperature gradient. And that occurs sometime after about 2 million years ago. When we go to the Atlantic, it's a messier story because the gradient's very small. It's only a couple of degrees. But you can see the blue site would be these sites over here. And obviously the blue site is cooler than the western site, which is in red. But then as you go back in time, at some point they're on top of each other. It'd be hard-pressed to say when that is, but I'd say it's somewhere in here. So I'm going to focus on the Indian Ocean, mainly because we know from modern observations that changes in Indian Ocean sea surface temperature are the main determinant of rainfall in East Africa. So when East Africa has anomalously wet conditions, are times when we have anomalously warm water parked off the coast of East Africa. So this is the location of these 2 sites here in the Indian Ocean. And this is a slide from Jess Tierney that just shows you what the climatological story is here in East Africa. So these are just, this is a composite for 3 recent years, for 1994, 97, and 96, where there were strong warmer SSTs than usual over here in the eastern part of the Indian Ocean, and cooler temperatures parked over here in the eastern Indian Ocean. And then when you look at the rainfall anomalies, and these are observations, you can see that over here we have anomalously high rainfall, and over here we have anomalously low rainfall. And you can see that these 2 fields map on top of each other. So it makes sense. There's, wherever you have anomalously warm water, you get greater atmospheric convection and greater rainfall. So returning to this site here, the site in the Indian Ocean, you'll remember that this site 722 is off of Oman. That's off of in the African upwelling region off the coast of Africa. And in red is this site that's off the coast of Australia to the east. And again, you can see they're sort of right on top of each other until about 2 million years ago. And what's amazing, to me anyway, is that almost within the same sample, and these are separated by an ocean, one goes cold and one goes warm, and they stay apart for the rest of that time. And that time is about 2 million years ago. This is the gradient. If you just calculate the difference between these two, interpolate them to the same age, and just calculate the difference, you can see what this gradient is. It goes from roughly 0 to a positive gradient of about 2 degrees centigrade. So if we put it all together, you can sort of see where I'm headed here, which is that the Indian Ocean sea surface temperature gradient seems to be emerging at the same time as when we have these isotopic indicators and these faunal indicators of increased grasslands. So this is where Alexei and Chris Brierley come in, where we test this hypothesis using a climate model where we just establish, we impose uniform sea surface temperature gradients for the Pacific only, and then for the Indian Ocean only, and then for the whole Indo-Pac region. So are you with me on that? So the idea is that we start with a control model that looks just like today's ocean, and then we impose uniform sea surface temperatures across the Pacific Ocean as if it were an El Nino year, and then run the model and see what happens to the rainfall. We do the same thing for the Indian Ocean, see what happens to the rainfall. Then we do it for the whole Indo-Pacific region and see what happens to the rainfall. We also did it for the Atlantic, but the Atlantic had no impact on East African climate. So what I'm showing here is actually a box that actually, these are all data points that will be familiar to the faunal people in the audience. These are all the sites of the hominin sites for the last 4 million years. And this is actually a data set that was sent very generously by Eric Delson to me. So we drew a box around this and said, well, let's look at the climate in this particular box. Let's see how climate changes in this box that we know where the hominin fossils are coming from. And this is just how the model simulates the rainfall in Africa. What we're going to be looking at is two things. One is the rainfall, of course, but we're also going to be looking at how the vertical circulation in the atmosphere is changing. And so this is just a map of the sea surface temperatures, the modern sea surface temperatures today, going from Africa to Indonesia to South America. And on the equator, you can see net rising motion to the top of the troposphere. So this is roughly 10 kilometers to the top of the troposphere. Rising motion is green, and descending motion is yellow. This is the Walker circulation, very well-developed Walker circulation. In the Indian Ocean, you have net rising motion over the eastern Indian Ocean because the warmer temperatures are there, and some descending motion here. And the Atlantic, of course, has a weak Walker circulation as well. So these are just what the flat Pacific experiment looks like. This is what the flat Indian experiment looks like. This is what the flat Indo-Pacific sea surface temperature experiment looks like. And these are the imposed sea surface temperature anomalies that went into the models. And let's just fast forward to what happens. So this is the control. This is what's happening today. Again, very well-developed Walker circulation in the Pacific with rising motion indicating in green, descending in yellow. When you remove the modern-day sea surface temperature gradient, that is, you make it flat across the Pacific, no surprise, the Walker circulation dies. You don't see any evidence for this vertical circulation in the atmosphere that would be the Walker circulation. But it doesn't really have that much of an impact on the Indian Ocean, except that you do get some change over here. But when we impose the flat Indian Ocean sea surface temperature over just the Indian Ocean, but leave the Pacific as it is today, one of the results is that we end up parking all this warm water where the upwelling used to be. And so that means that you get a lot of atmospheric convection parked right over East Africa. It rains. It makes it wetter. So when you have a weak east-west temperature gradient across the Indian Ocean, you get more convection, more rainfall over East Africa. And that's, in fact, that is East Africa right there. And then when we do put a flat sea surface temperature gradient for the Indian and the Pacific, we still get that convection over East Africa because the Indian Ocean dominates. It's a proximal ocean. So this blue indicates convection over East Africa. So if we look at it spatially, this is the result of the combined Indian-Pacific experiments. And this just shows you where it was wetter when we imposed the flat sea surface temperature gradients. And you can see that it's including a lot of places where we find our fossils. This is, again, the fossil locations. And this is how the climate or how the rainfall changes seasonally in this model run for the different experiments. So the control in this case is the green. You can see we have 2 rainy seasons as we do in this region. And when you just jump to the flat Indo-Pacific, you'll see that the red line of rainfall is overall higher for every month. The short rains increase markedly, but basically the whole time increases. What changes is the seasonality of rainfall in this model. That we're actually getting rainfall not uniformly throughout the year, but we're getting rainfall throughout the year. The net result is that imposing uniform sea surface temperatures increases East African rainfall by 30%. So it's a big number. So I would propose that I think this expansion of more open habitats after roughly 2 million years might have been due to the emergence of these sea surface temperature gradients that occurred at that time. How all of this plays into this part over here on the right-hand side, I can throw out all sorts of conjectures, but following Richard's caution, I'm not going to. There are some things that we can comment on, which is that each one of these bars here is one of those Sapropel layers that I talked about in the Mediterranean. So we know throughout this whole time period, African climate has been pulsing between wet and dry, and those are huge oscillations, right? I mean, remember what happened just for the most recent one. North Africa was covered with lakes. It was fully vegetated. People were living in the middle of the Sahara happily. And that has happened every 20,000 years, roughly, for the last, in this case, 4.5 million years. But it goes back even 10 million years. So superimposed on this pendulum of wet and dry conditions is this long-term sort of secular change. And to me, it's that interplay between the variability that Rick Potts was talking about and the sort of long-term secular change, which is sort of what Elizabeth Verba had been talking about. I think it's a marriage of those two things that we really don't know much about. And I think for me, if I had to propose a frontier, I think that's, from the climate side, that's something that we can actually really make some progress on. And that's actually what Cassie's going to be talking about, some very initial data. So the summary is that the grasslands expanded after 2 million years. I would argue that none of the available hypotheses really work. So this one in the ocean seems to work. And these are just some questions I'd like to throw out, but I'll shut up so that you can ask questions of me. So thank you. No questions. Eric. And then Rowan.
Combining what you and Renee said. Renee, correct me, but it looked like your Bovid changes began a little before 2.5. In that case, we can assume that there must have been some change in climate before that. Now, you're talking about expansion after 2, which is clearly when the major change occurred. But how early and for what reason did this surface temperature gradient transform is the question.
So I think that might even be, oh darn. So I normally have a slide after this. The next slide. So that is the question. Why did this whole thing happen? And I have to say it is still the really big question that's out there. There's a paper in review right now in EPSL that argues that it's a change in the temperature of the water that's being upwelled. So essentially, if you were upwelling water that's the same temperature as what's already at the surface or near it, then this coupled ocean-atmosphere feedback thing isn't going to happen because you're not imposing any change. So Christina Ravello and some others have some evidence that has happened. Now, if you ask why did that happen, I can't help you.
We know with the PETM that there appears to have been some kind of deep ocean carbon change that led to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Can you suggest anything like that? Or could it be the 3 MA glacial, Northern Hemisphere glaciation, taking a while to cut in?
As much as I'd like to say I could answer that, we really can't. This is really something where I think, an infusion of research dollars from NSF is needed. And so somewhere in here is... Sure. So that would be my recommendation. So Rowan and then Kate.
We know that after 800,000 years ago, the CO2 levels become fairly low, oscillating between about 180 and 280, 300 ppm, with most of the time being below about 280, 260 ppm. And that's that low CO2 condition we know strongly favors C4. Now the question is when does that get set in? If you just use the 018 CO2 record that we see over the last 800,000 years ago, where they're not perfectly, but they're roughly oscillating together.
Right.
If we just use the 018 record as an indication, well, that's starting as we come into the last 2.5 to 3 million years. You're making that one last dip down to the Pleistocene CO2. So the question is when does this low CO2 record set in? Is it possible that it's at this time? Because the proxy record on CO2 loses resolution as we go below about 400 ppm. And it seems like we might be sort of oscillating around 300 to 400 for much of the late Miocene. And then as we go out of the Pliocene, boom, we go down to the Pleistocene CO2. So I wouldn't give up on that hypothesis quite so quickly, because it also could explain, you know, the northern hemisphere glaciation and the setting up of this sea surface temperature profile.
Right, no, and I think, I mean, that slide that you showed that, you know, you're right on that threshold between favoring C4 and C3, and I think that's a good point that once you start dipping below 200, you can really activate the C4 preference. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we go below 250, actually.
Yeah. Well, the one person in the world who could answer the question is Bärbel Hunisch, and she's in the back. And she published a paper that goes right about this time, but it stopped. So, Bärbel, do we have any more insight about what happened at 2 million years ago for CO2?
There's not that much happening at 2 million years ago. It's mostly what is happening is that, thank you, at about 2.7 million years ago. Is that on?
Yep, it's working.
At about 2.7 million years ago, that's when we see that the carbon dioxide levels actually dropped during glacial times. They don't really do very much during interglacial times, but it's an overall small decrease. But it's not nowhere near as pronounced as the oxygen isotopes are.
Okay. And there's nothing that you know of happening around 2 million yet?
No. 2 million years sees glacials that have a little bit higher CO2, but there's nothing really dramatic that is happening around that time.
Okay. Kate's been waiting to ask a question. And then I'll just take maybe one more, and then we'll break.
Thank you. Peter, that was a very eloquent presentation. My question is about the 40,000-year cycle that is pacing glacial advance and retreat during this time. And I'm asking if you could speculate on how that would influence these thermal gradients in the tropical ocean, and would you expect to see? We see the precessional pacing throughout the period, as you mentioned, and you're arguing for this sort of longer secular term change in the gradients. But where's the ice beat?
So I can tell you that there are only a few sites that have that kind of resolution. One moment. There, this one, and that one, and boom, boom. So the only sites that have that resolution, you see this gray site that's in here, this is from Tim Herbert's paper that came out last year or a year and a half ago. It's from the same location, but it's much higher resolution, and frankly, it's a better record. This is Yongsung Huang's record, who's also from Brown, has a lab next door. So you can see they map each other pretty well, but when you look at Tim's record, the SST records here really look a lot like ice volume. And that, you know, the glacials are cooler, interglacials are warmer. There's a 40K world in here. So this record looks a lot like ice volume in terms of the pacing. And that's also true for the Western Pacific and for the Eastern Pacific, where we have really high-res records. And that's also actually true for 662. So on the orbital pacing, it sort of looks like an ice volume record, but the gradient story doesn't look like ice volume, and that's cool. So one more question, or we can, okay. Mikhail.
Comment, you put up questions for the group. Your question number 2, what happened to on the ground?
It's coffee break time.
Yeah.
No.
Life on the ground.
Yeah.
If what you suggest happened, that you still have rainy seasons, but you have rainfall throughout the year, I think from the ungulates perspective, that's a huge difference. Because that's when you can have what I think we see, mixed feeders in huge amounts and highly specialized, and not needing to fall back on grass only during the dry season, for example. So something like that could have a really enormous impact on the communities.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, if there was a climate modeler in the group, they should be calling me out because the seasonality picture that I showed there is basically an imposed result. It's making assumptions about the seasonal cycle that we don't know. So it's an artifact, a little bit of the boundary conditions we imposed in those experiments. But that said, that's what comes out in the record, is that you get an overall elevation of rainfall throughout the year.